Okay. Anyway, hello everyone. We're having a special little podcast here. Mike White with Ezra Dantowitz coming on, a well-known observer, as is Ben Dantowitz and now Daniel Dantowitz in the East, and we're gonna come on and talk about observers and the future and the past and everything about them. So we're gonna start off going in chronological order, kind of how observing came into roundnet. The first time I ever saw it was at regionals in 2015 because we had serving lines. I don't ever remember having serving lines before that. And at all the tournaments, it was kind of just honor system. You would just hope that they were serving. Occasionally on sand, we would check out someone's foot, but on grass, we never really did that much because you couldn't really tell. So at regionals, we had serving lines, and I remember a couple of my matches were observed. But not much came out of it. And I don't really remember going to the observers that often. And then at nationals, we had a ton of observers for the later rounds, which I guess mostly were for foot faults and the disagreements. But again, I don't remember that many calls going to observers.
Yeah, that sounds right. I just remember 2015 regionals, there being observers in the finals and not in the third place game because it was you guys playing against Dirt, and you were like, well, we know each other pretty well.
We're probably
Don't
fine.
think we need somebody else.
We're
Yeah.
not going to argue. Yeah, so that kind of just stayed how it was. It wasn't, I don't think, I don't remember last year how I guess steady we were with the use of observers or even serving lines. You know, some tournaments were on turf, so we didn't. Of course, sand. But then eventually everyone is kind of, well, nationals, everyone ran wild and was observing. We had like so many observers going around, and at regionals in 2016 we had the observer jerseys, so everyone was looking fresh too. And people were kind of getting more into observing. I think that's when the postseason last year is when it got a lot more serious.
Yeah, I definitely remember observing at some of the tour stops last year. I know like DC and Chicago. I don't remember there being observers at some of the other ones. And it's always tough because I guess what you're looking for changes depending on whether there are lines, what your surface you're playing on. Because especially with sand and turf last year, a lot of those tour stops, there's really not much the observer can do to, I guess, check if the server's close without lines.
Yeah.
So you're kind of just watching for pockets, rims, other stuff.
Yeah.
And just the way serving has evolved, especially even in the last year, I guess the observer's job has morphed a lot too.
Mm-hmm. And then coming into this year, Jack Scotty, director of USA Spikeball, made observer guidelines, kind of separate from the official rules on how to observe. And then later from that's been out for a good amount of time.
Yeah.
And then just in the past couple months, we have observer certification. And at Camp Ridge Hill, we taught a course to try it out. People took the test there, and now there's a test online, so you can get certified as an observers. So that's been pretty good in trying to solidify, get good observers and make sure they know all the right calls, which is also, we noticed that a lot of players don't know the right calls, which is even more helpful. But we kind of want to get into like the basic observer guidelines and kind of why we have observers and maybe like some misconceptions about them and stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess like the biggest thing you'll see at tournament is like the active calls that the observer makes, and that starts with the serve. So for a clean serve, you have to be behind 6 feet. You have to contact the ball outside 6 feet. So that's kind of the reach rule that's been newer implemented in the last few months. And if you're stepping, you can only take essentially one side step, and your back foot can't come up. So the observer's watching for all those things, and that's the biggest thing. Getting the point going that the observer is kind of always responsible for when you have an observer, because the observer can make those active calls without the teams coming to them. So unlike a pocket or a rim while the point's being played, where I guess the players will have to see if they disagree and then decide to go to the observer can make those calls on the serve immediately and is supposed to make those calls on the serve so that the players don't necessarily have to worry about that in the moment.
Yeah, and we actually had a discussion about that at some point where people were talking about how they can play a pocket. But these observer calls that they're calling right away, they cannot play, and they're forced to have a fault on that. And it was kind of tough to there was discussion, but it's kind of a tough thing to look at because, of course, that changes the game when there's observers and when there are not.
Right.
Because, you know, in the round of 16, you don't have an observer and someone is reaching in, like, you just have to call them on it, I guess, or you don't even call them on it. It's kind of hard to do that.
Yeah,
But
like
with observers, it's more of an active. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and then, sorry. And then
Yeah, I was just gonna say,
okay.
on active calls. So like one of the things that comes up for us a lot is those active calls. Even if you have an observer, doesn't mean that only the observer can call it. It's just those are the things that the observer can call without being asked to call, but the players can still call it. So especially on sand, if somebody steps in close and you saw where their foot was, you can say this is where their foot was. That's inside 6 feet. That's a foot fault without the observer necessarily doing it. And that's definitely happened to us before. And it's just good to know as the players that you don't necessarily need to wait for the observer to make the call. It's just they're able to make that call without you going to them.
And similar to that, if these observers aren't refs, so if the observers do not make the call, it does not mean that there is not a call. For example, if there is maybe a double contact, again, and the observers don't call it, not even the other team should call it. Like, you should still call it on yourself. You know, it's not like, hey, the observers didn't see it, I can get away with it, because a lot of times the other team is hoping that the observers see it, or that you're going to call yourself, and you know, that kind of spirals off it. So these observers are essentially just extra pairs of eyes, because during the play, that was the biggest focus that I found for the early observers, was that I don't want to, as a player, have to watch the server's lines. The line. I don't want to have to watch the serving line, because I'm looking over air, and it happens all the time. I look to my right as they serve, and then it rips at my partner, and I'm not ready to go retrieve the ball. So having observers just takes that off of you, and same thing with all the other calls. They just make sure that I don't have to constantly be watching things or think about things, especially with the active calls, because there's so many times where something will happen and you're just not ready, or you don't want to call it because you're unsure, and having observers are there.
Yeah, I like to think that the observer kind of protects the returner a little bit as far as some of those calls. So the returning team doesn't necessarily need to worry to watch the server's feet because the observer is doing that, and same for the reach. So it gives you an opportunity to stay in the game as opposed to trying to make the call while you're playing, which is much more difficult, especially on server turns where it's happening pretty quick a lot of the time.
Yeah, you don't want to have to think about it too. And then something else that I wrote down here is that observing is not a voting system in two ways. One is going to the observers. You do not, if in the, it does not need to be a 2-2 split from the teams to say, I want to go to the observers because we disagree. You want to go to the observers when you want to get the best perspective. And sometimes we encourage you to talk about it yourself, and you and Ben do that all the time, right?
Yeah, like often we'll disagree and end up going to the observer, or if we disagree, able to talk it through before just sending it directly to the observer, which I think both are good results. If you're able to talk it through, especially with your partner and the other team, a lot of people will immediately like see, well, I would disagree, go to the observer, but often step back, say what you saw, and you can kind of get the answer.
Yeah. Well, I think you should always talk it out, because sometimes you can either reason it out with the other team or point something out that the observer might not have thought about. I remember we had one discussion when we had an observer. We're talking about it. I think it was a rim versus a pocket, and after like a minute of discussion, we could have just went right to the observer, but I said, I think if it was a rim, the ball would have shot this way instead of where it went, and the person on the other team said, that makes sense, and changed their mind. And the same thing is like that also could have been pointed out to the observer as you're discussing things. I also encourage everyone to just discuss things more thoroughly during the game. But sometimes you see different things, and you can't really help it. And then same thing.
I know. I just make the distinction. Like, I think it's good to explain to the observer and teams like your perspective when you're going to them, especially on some mixed up calls where you necessarily didn't see what happened in order or whatever. But I don't think it's good for the teams to like be arguing their point to the observer once you decided to go to
definitely
them.
Not. Yeah, definitely not.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then also some misconception people might not know if they didn't take the observer certification is that making the call is not based on voting. Again, it's all about the best perspective. So if all three observers or two observers both have a very good perspective and disagree, then they're going to disagree on the call, and it might be a replay. But if one, say there's one person was in front of the play and one observer was behind the play, if they see different things, well, you're probably going to trust the observer who is in front, and you're going to defer to them for the call. You just want to find the truth, and that works when you're arguing it with your friends or the other team and the observers.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Is no matter how many observers you have, whether it's an odd or even number, it's really never supposed to be a voting system. It's just whoever has the best view, you're going to go with their call because in theory they're the most likely to see what actually happened. Mm-hmm. And so that's why it's important for when you're going to the observers, give the observers a chance, if there is more than one, to talk amongst themselves before they decide what they're going to go with.
Yeah, and branching off of that too, it's really like being an observer is not about just knowing the rules. You got to stress the getting in position. Because if you're not in position to make the call, like if you watch referees, no, we're not referees, but if you watch referees in other sports, they are like constantly moving around. Often like they avoid the players, but they're pretty close. Mm-hmm. I mean, in football, they start literally in the play, right? They're in the play. And as an observer, you really should be moving and shuffling your head and getting in close and not being afraid to get in close, like a cameraman, to try to get that view. I've seen a lot of observers stand 20, 30 feet away from the net, and that might work for the serve. And even on serves, you have to adjust your feet on a serves. If you think they're going to come at this angle, take a step over and get that view. So I think that's really important going forward, is that observers are more active and really move to get in the correct position. It's just tough, especially when you have 4 observers, which is what we've been doing recently. Chris Reuter was surprised we had all 4 observers, but we realized we want all the angles covered.
Yeah,
we don't want to miss anything. Yeah, it's important.
I think it's funny, how big a difference going from 3 to 4 is, because I know for the semifinal at Chicago we had 3, and every point somebody's moving to be back in position, whereas at 4, you're still moving a little bit, but you don't need to like rotate around the whole net. So it's nice that you have more angles covered right away.
Yeah, having 4 is nice, but also what I noticed is you can kind of feel a little lazy when you're in your position. Of course, you should always be active, but when you're in 3 and you're constantly moving, it kept me really focused in Columbus. When you, Harding, and I, every point we had to adjust to who was serving, and that kind of kept me focused and in the game. Whereas at Summer Spike, when I was one of 4 observers, I kind of felt a little just kind of weird just standing in that one spot and covering that. But that's just something we're used to.
I get what you're saying. One of the things that helps, I guess, is especially before starting, if there's multiple observers, breaking down like based on who's standing where, who's responsible for what call, so that even if there are 4 observers, there's probably something that you're responsible for. So you might feel like, there's 4 of us, I don't need to watch, but you have like one duty that's like, this is just me, so I need to make sure I watch to see if the Fuengo serve pockets, or if the Fuengo serve he reaches in, something like that. I think that way this is exactly where I want to be to make that call for this server, and I'm ready to make that call if it comes to me, if it's that play.
Yeah, and I remember in Columbus you said person on the left takes foot, person on the right takes lean, so that it didn't matter whoever it was, which pair of us it was, we always knew what to do. And that's something with the 4-person system we didn't really talk about, because so I didn't know who had lean, who had foot, and all this stuff.
Yeah, so that's a good example of something that's always changing too, just based on who's serving. So if you've got somebody who's like Peter John, who serves pretty well both ways, obviously, depending on where you're standing, you'll have a better view to see if he moved his feet or if he reached on that serve. So it might not be just always the person on the left, but if he's flangoing, then it's the person on the left who has to watch for the reach. And if he's taking a sidestep, then it's the person on the right. Mm-hmm. And so that's why it's just good to make sure that all the observers are coordinated and know what they're supposed to be doing. And I think that helps to keep you engaged also.
Yeah, and also knowing where to position yourself, because with Chris Hornacek's serve, it's mostly just straight up and down. So I can kind of just line up right on the plane. To worry about the reach, I can be right on the plane. But for someone else who uses more side steps, and Chris is using more now, but if someone uses more side steps, you kind of have to lean a little bit and take a different angle. And then, like you said, when I observing against Tyler Chiswick, I always took into Patrick Drucker, who always do their forehand. It was much easier to observe because I just found that angle and just stayed on it. When it's Peter John, sometimes that's why it's nice to have 3 or 4, because you can cover both sides.
Yeah,
But it
exactly.
is hard to go from the foot right up to the ankle. Or you got to. I mean, I'm sorry. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. No, I like that's why like observing alone with lines is tough because you know you have to make the call for the foot fault and the reach, and
And
it's just tough to
rims,
see all that at
and
once. Yeah,
rims, and
exactly. And
pockets.
yeah, exactly. Zoom right over and see if it's a pocket or rim. And so it just takes like a lot of getting used to. I've said that just like playing, where knowing the server and knowing their serves makes a difference because you know where it's going to go. Observing it makes a big difference if you know the servers and you know based on their stance which way it looks like they're going because you're ready to make that call.
Right. And again, uh, like when you're like we said earlier, when we only have one observer, you really should focus. Well, we have you focus in the guidelines, but you should mostly focus on just the foot faults and the leans because the players can like the players do not have a good view on the foots or the leans, and they
Right.
shouldn't. But
Yeah.
they can if you can't call the pocket properly, like that's okay. They have a better grasp of that. So you kind of got to take away what's the hardest for the players themselves to call, so that they can
Hmm.
do it. So
Yeah.
with this, do you think that in the future we will need referees, or can it always stay with observers? Like at some point, could it be that we have 4 observers, and if they don't make the call, then it's just that call? And a lot of people have been wanting rims to be active calls, and have thought rims to be active calls, so that the point's just over.
Yeah, I think the way it's working now with observers makes sense. I think there's a lot of pressure thinking that referees will be significantly different or better, but at the same time, like a referee is still going to be getting the same views that observers have now. Ideally, the observers now know the rules as well as any referee would. So I think like if you have a good observer now, or if you want to be a good observer now, the amount that they add to the game isn't necessarily that much different. And as far as the observer not making calls on everything, well, you'd say maybe a referee would. I think it's still good that we have players kind of making those calls and talking it out because just based on the nature of the game, the players will often have a better perspective than the observers. And that's something that's not unique to roundnet,
Right.
but isn't seen in all sports. So like baseball, where you have the first base umpire curl around and has a better view to see if the runner was safe at first
Mm-hmm.
than either the first baseman or the runner. In
Right.
roundnet, the players are going to be right on top of the net. If it hits rim or if it rolls up into the pocket and then bounces up, it's often easier to see from the player perspective than the observer, just because the player are always going to be inside and the observer is always going to have the chance to be blocked out by a player.
Yeah, and
So there's really no way around that right now in the current system. I don't think that necessarily a referee will add that much more.
that makes me think about the Nashville finals, end of game 2, I think, when um, Chris Hornacek whiffed a hit,
Yeah.
and it would have, he whiffed it on the way off, so it would have been illegal. And Kenny thought he did, Chris thought he didn't, and they're both right at the net.
Hmm.
Like Chris is swinging at the net, Kenny's standing at the net, and they disagreed on the call. And I'm like, that's the worst case because they both have a great perspective and disagree. Like
Yeah.
in that case, the observers, like, given the observers are in their normal serving or their starting position, like they probably have a worse view than those two, especially on a little thing like Chris hitting it. Um,
Right.
so it just felt like weird in that situation because, of course, what you do is you go to the observers, but like they're not who have the best perspective. But I guess they did have the second best perspective because the best perspectives disagreed.
Yeah. That's also a good point to mention, though, that playing, you're often in a different mindset than observing. And so even if you don't necessarily have the best view, if you're able to see something, it's often easier to evaluate what happened if you're not also in active playing. So something like that, where the observers are standing and watching to see what plays out, essentially, it
Yeah.
might be easier to make the call than for Chris or Kenny, who's right in the heat of it in the moment.
Something else, I think it was during the quarter. No, it was during the semifinals. So I think they had observers, and I don't remember if the same thing Nashville. I don't know if the observers ended up seeing it or if they didn't call it. So Jesse Showalter had a block, and I believe he thought it doubled. Vinny thought it doubled, or Vinny didn't see it, and Point Loma thought it was bad. But from my view, when I talked to the observers after, they thought it was good. So should there be the responsibility of the observers to let them know? Because because none of them had a good perspective because it was so quick, and they just all kind of went with the wrong call. Is there some responsibility to make sure? Is there a responsibility to make sure that the right call is made?
I think that's a question for the governing board, but I think so. One of the things that just slight tangent, going to Boston finals, there was a call where they called like side pocket on the serve and went to the observers, or they called rim on the serve and went to the observers, and the observers came back and said side pocket, and kind of the fans were like, wait, what? Like nobody asked if it was a side pocket.
Right, they asked if it was rim or bad.
Yeah, rim or bad, and we said,
or rim or good. Like, sorry, rim or good.
Yeah, okay, something along those lines. But we came back and we were pretty confident that the right call was side pockets. That's what we said. And it was one of those instances like, well, what are the observers actually allowed to do? What are the guidelines that we want them to be able to do? And so I think making the right call is important, and we should get there. And if they go to you, I think it's best that you come back with the right call rather than like a literal interpretation of did what you say happened. Yeah. But a play like Nashville where, nobody thought to ask the observers, right now I'd say the observers did the right thing in sitting back. But I think we probably should consider like see something, say something approach to observing almost, where if you know.
Well, a point can be an active call, you know?
Yeah. I mean, but
I guess that would be score. Like an active call is incorrect score. So they could call no incorrect score. That was actually Ohio's point.
Yeah, I'd say that's a technicality.
I know, yeah. I'm just kidding. Yeah. But it's just really just weird to see because I was really confused. I just yelled at Jesse like, "Was that block not good?" And he just was like, "Oh, that was good." He's like, "I didn't see it." Yeah. So
that's one of those things where being an observer different from being a fan. Whereas a fan, like I feel like not that I can yell at the players, but I feel like I can interact with them and it's fine. Whereas an observer, you don't want to because you feel like you have more of an impact on the game. Again, but one of those plays where if a fan yells out like, "Hey, Jesse, that was good," you should ask the observer. You'd be like, "Well, yeah, like if you come to us after that, we're gonna have to say it's good." There's nothing really wrong with that right now. Right. But I don't think that makes sense. That would be the best way for them to find out that their hit was good.
We've talked about that before. Like what that gets into coaching and other things like that too.
There's a lot more.
Yeah. But like, why couldn't I just say, "Hey, that was good," and then because they just they just had a bad perspective, and they all did. So, like, is it not within my right just to let them know? You know, but we'll see. I don't know. That was a very interesting case.
I think it should be. I think it should probably be laid out more clearly, like whether an observer is allowed to speak up against a call they know is wrong. Yeah. But
I'm asking even a fan. Like I can say whatever I want.
Yeah, so I guess that's a good point. So for me, if I'm playing and a fan's like, "Oh, I saw this," I would never take their word as like, oh, they're the observer.
But he could ask the observer. Yeah.
But if the fan says like, "You should ask the observer," I'm totally okay with that as either a player or an observer. I think that's totally okay.
Like I was just confused in the moment, and I didn't want to shout anything out in case they were going to go to observers because I didn't want to give my opinion. You know, sometimes people feel weird about that. Although I could definitely give my opinion, but I didn't want to.
Yeah, it gets back to the point of like, should coaching be allowed at any level? Yeah. And so I think it gets murky pretty fast. But yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move into and quick touch up on the reason kind of we were talking about this, which is the big discussion on Facebook surrounding Origin Impact versus Chaos in Chicago. So do you remember what happened? You want to give a lowdown?
Yes, I don't remember what the score was, but late in Game 3 in extras, Chaos was leading up the half break, so serving to win. And I think Bonin was serving to Chris Hornacek, and Chris returned the serve, got the set, and then as he approached the net, he kicked some sand into the net. The net pretty clearly moved and then got the kill. And so from the sideline, I think a lot of people watching saw like the net moving, and you know that if the net moves, it's an infraction, so it's the other team's point. Mm-hmm. But the observers didn't say anything, and Chaos didn't say anything in the moment, so Impact took the point and kind of just moved on. And so for me, watching on the sideline, my initial reaction was like, it looked like he moved the net, like touched the net, that should be Chaos's point. But watching it back, it's harder to say like definitively that he touched the net himself versus he kicked some sand and the sand moved the net, which is kind of one of the trickiest parts I think of observing on sand. Yep. Is that while if you're playing on grass and you see the net move before a player hits the ball, you know that the player hit the net. Like there's no other way for the net to move. But on sand, it's kind of a gray area where if you kick some sand into the net, you're not going to be penalized because you're not really touching the net. You're just moving the sand around the net, and the net happens to move. So there's got to be some boundary at which, well, either you moved the net enough or you moved enough sand that you would have hit the net. That's now not
Right.
good, and it's the other team's point.
It's as if there's kind of an invisible barrier. There could be.
Right.
There could be. Not right now.
Yeah.
I remember seeing that, and I knew, like, a lot of times I'll see a point, and I don't know what the call is, but I know there's going to be a discussion. And that was one of them that I saw that. So Chaos didn't say anything at the time, or did they discuss it after the point?
No, they moved around. Nobody said anything at the time.
Okay.
I know from the sideline we were all kind of yelling at ourselves, but there was nothing on the field. They kind of moved on as if
okay.
I don't think Chaos saw it in the moment at all.
And the observers didn't call it, but again, we don't know if they were prepared to see it.
But also it could have been they saw the net move, but they didn't see him touch the net,
right.
which is also like that's fine.
It's something, and also people were saying that Chris, like, how do you not know you kicked the net? But I'm pretty sure if you're diving over the net to save the game, you're not concerned with what your shin's doing.
Yeah, right.
Which is how I took it in that moment. Yeah.
Even I'm not necessarily convinced that Chris touched the net at any point. I think he definitely touched sand that led the net to move. So like, there's no reason to think that he would feel the net if he's not touching it.
Yeah.
And so it's hard to say that he did anything wrong or that he even like committed an infraction because he probably didn't touch the net itself. He probably moved enough sand to move the net. But at a certain point, it's like, well, if you move enough sand, that's kind of the same as touching the net.
Yeah.
And so where's that distinction?
Right. And as of right now, we said at worst it's a replay, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving on, there was also a second one later in the game that was probably even more of a discussion.
That was a body block?
Yeah.
Yeah, earlier in the game, I think.
Oh, that was earlier?
Yeah, that was before.
Okay. I thought it was so same thing. Chaos was leading, and I believe Chris hit it into Matt Bonin, and he blocked it on and off the net, but immediately Drucker said it doubled Bonin. I think the initial call was a double.
Yeah, it was either double or that Bonin touched the net.
Yes. I think it was maybe it was like touch the net and he didn't touch the net, or Chris said touch the net because he came up to the net like this. So I think Chris initially said he touched the net, which he didn't, or people said he didn't after. People said he didn't after in the footage. Okay. But then Drucker said no, it doubled you, which I might have an opinion on. But so the issue there with the observing was that, of course, Chaos thought it was clean. Drucker insisted it was a double, and the observers did not see it. And I think a lot of people in the crowd, again, and on Periscope, were saying that it was clean, and it just led to a very unfortunate situation where Chaos thought they had a win, and there was really no call to be made because Impact disagreed, and not saying they were lying and trying to disagree on purpose, but because they disagreed, it had to be redone, and then Impact ended up winning, and Chaos was kind of put on tilt because of that.
Yeah, it's just an example where it's kind of up to the players to use their best judgment, and if you really think you saw something, it's totally in your right to make that call. And so it comes down to the observers, and if the observers don't necessarily have a clear view, the best they can do is send it back to the players.
Right.
But that's what we were saying before. How the observers have to make sure they're in the game and have the views, so that if it comes to them, especially at a crucial point like that, even if it's tough to end it like that they make the call that they need to make. I know that like us' round of 16 series, I think ended with serving to Nashberg. Nashberg called pocket or whatever, or high. It wasn't high.
Yeah, no, I think Joel either missed it or caught it and said pocket. And they went to the observers, and Weiler immediately said, no, I put backspin on it. And it went to the observers, and the observers said it was good, and he lost on that. But that's how confident he was making that call.
Yeah, it stinks for especially that team that's losing on a call like that. And it's tough to be the observer in that position where you're ending somebody's maybe that's the observer's job. I think it's important that the observers are ready to make that call, even though, especially it's likely going to be your friend on either side. You're making a call again.
Yeah. And I'm actually losing your audio quality there. Your audio quality is going down. Don't know why. But I do want to say, when I
Okay.
did watch, we only have a view of the periscope. It kind of does look like it went off his body and then his arm. I'm not completely sure, but I think that's the camp that I'm sitting in right now. And it's mostly based off on the trajectory that Chris hit it and then the trajectory it came off the net.
Okay.
That's what I looked at most. I looked at Chris hitting it towards his body and then it coming off as if it hit his arm. But of course, that's just Periscope, and I could be totally wrong, but that was what I initially looked at.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. But even so, being Periscope, you've got the advantage of watching it a bunch of times rather than just seeing it once happen live action.
Exactly. Like, the observers make a call. I remember when I had to make a call, like, it's so hard in the moment to just make that call.
Yeah.
Like, but you have to, and you just kind of know it in your gut, especially with rims and pockets. But I think I'm a rim-heavy observer.
I said that I'm a rim light observer, but yeah.
You're a rim light observer? I'm a rim heavy observer. Last year I had to tell
I'm
Nashburg
definitely a
that they
rim
lost.
light player. Yeah.
They thought it was good and they come back. I go, no, that was rim, and they were out of East Regionals. Yeah. But you got to be straight. I should have just said redo. Just kidding. Don't do that.
No.
I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Make your calls.
Yeah, exactly. Like, you're gonna miss calls. It's okay to miss calls. But be assertive when you do.
Oh,
make
and I
call.
think after some, well, I observed in Philadelphia, and after the match, Alex Harris comes up to me and goes, "Yeah, I disagree with 2 of your calls, but okay." And I'm like, "Yeah. I probably would too."
And I remember at Summer Spike, I observed Strange versus Impact, and there were at least 2 calls where like Chris Hornacek hit a serve. They came to me and like ended up calling pocket. And Chris didn't agree, but then later in the day, I was like, "Yeah, I'll observe your game if you want to." He was like, "If you want me to." And he was like, "Yeah, I mean, I disagree with your calls from earlier, but like, I still trust your opinion. Like, I want you guys to observe."
Yeah.
And I think that's the right spirit to have. It's like, not necessarily that like observers are gonna blow calls, but like you have to be okay with what the observer says because that's the position we have, and that's really the best we're gonna do to get in the right call right now.
Yeah, and that's something also important is just even if you disagree, just take the call, know the value in the observers. And know that if you didn't have them, you'd be getting a replay or something else like that. But and they're gonna make calls. That's all. They're gonna make bad calls. They're gonna make good calls. They're gonna make calls.
Yeah.
But overall, I think it's great we have them. I'm excited because I think regionals and nationals we're gonna have a ton of them if we get the volunteers.
Yeah, you're gonna be observing a lot. You think or no?
No, I'm retired from observing.
Oh, okay, right.
No,
maybe in Montreal if you don't make finals.
You're gonna be asked. Oh yeah, maybe. Okay, maybe I'll observe this weekend. Because your audio is going and now your video is kind of going, I think we should end it here.
What can we do? Okay.
But thanks, Ezra. Fun observer talk. I think we'll now get people into the coaching discussion. We have to go from one to the next.
Yeah, naturally.
But pretty good. I hope this helps some people with observers and just for us to talk observers. So people understand more. But overall,
this is fun.
Yeah, fun. It's weird. I'm looking over on one screen and I can see your video, but on the stream it is just not working. You haven't moved from your little smile in like 5 minutes.
Well, that's kind of creepy, but
yeah, that was very creepy. All right. Well, thanks for coming on. I will see you on Saturday, and everyone else.
Yep.
Thanks for listening. Peace out.
Adios.